My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old, and last night at a family dinner, my brother stood up, raised his glass, and announced he was moving into my house. The only problem? The house isn't mine anymore, and he had no idea. From that moment, the air shifted. Forks froze halfway to mouths. My mother forced a smile, but her eyes betrayed panic. My brother smirked, thinking he'd just secured a victory in some silent family war. What he didn't know was that behind that confident grin, he had walked straight into a trap he could never crawl out of. Because you see, I've spent months preparing for this, and while he thought he was taking over my home, he was about to learn that revenge doesn't knock, it waits until you invite it in. Stay with me. This story changes everything. Before we continue, please subscribe. I wish I could say it was just another ordinary Sunday dinner, but from the moment I walked into my parents' house, something felt off. The smell of roast chicken and garlic mashed potatoes, usually comforting, clung too heavy in the air, almost suffocating. The dining room was already set, my mother fussing with silverware while my father adjusted his glasses, pretending to read the newspaper he hadn't turned a page on in 10 minutes. My brother, Daniel, sat at the far end of the table, arms crossed, his grin too smug for no reason at all. Family dinners weren't exactly a tradition we kept up joyfully. They were obligations, forced smiles over strained relationships. I had worked hard to keep my distance, carving out a life of independence after years of being overlooked. But that night, I showed up because Mom insisted it would be good for the family. Deep down, I knew it meant something was brewing. As I slid into my seat, Daniel glanced at me with a look I recognized instantly, the one he used as a kid when he knew a secret he couldn't wait to throw in my face. He was always the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. When we were younger, if I brought home a B+, it was a disappointment. If he brought home a C, it was still a celebration. That unspoken imbalance followed us into adulthood, and it lingered in every conversation, every comparison, every sigh of disapproval directed my way. The small talk started the way it always did, Mom asking about work, Dad commenting on the weather, Daniel making snide remarks disguised as jokes. I tried to tune it out, focusing on cutting my food into small, deliberate pieces. But I couldn't ignore the way Daniel tapped his fork against his plate, an irritating rhythm that matched the smug curve of his smile. He was waiting for a moment, the perfect opening to drop whatever bomb he had prepared. And then, as if rehearsed, he cleared his throat, lifted his glass, and announced, "I've decided I'm moving in." The words cut through the clatter of cutlery, leaving silence in their wake. He looked directly at me as he said it, his eyes gleaming like he had just checkmated me in a game I didn't know we were playing. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Moving into my house? The one I had poured my savings into, the one I had worked overtime for, skipping vacations and dinners just to afford? I felt the room tilt for a moment, my mother's forced laugh filling the void. "Oh, Daniel, you always have such big announcements," she said. But her voice was too tight, her hands trembling as she adjusted the salt shaker unnecessarily. I looked at my father, expecting some reaction, maybe even a correction, but he just kept his eyes fixed on his plate, chewing slowly, avoiding my gaze. That silence told me more than words ever could. Something was wrong. I tried to steady my breath to keep my composure, but my chest tightened with every second that passed. Daniel leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his wine, waiting for me to explode, waiting for me to ask how dare he. But I didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, I swallowed hard, forced a smile, and let the moment hang heavy in the room. Because deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Something darker lurked behind his announcement, and I was about to find out exactly what it was. The silence after Daniel's announcement pressed down on me like a weight. My smile stayed fixed, though my heart hammered so loud I was sure everyone at the table could hear it. He had said the words so casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for him to move into the house I had spent years fighting to call my own. The way his eyes lingered on me wasn't just arrogance, it was a dare. He wanted me to react, to lose control, to confirm for everyone watching that he had finally gotten under my skin. I forced myself to chew, to act unbothered, but the food turned to sand in my mouth. My mother laughed nervously again, this time a little too high-pitched, quickly launching into a story about a neighbor's new puppy as if she could erase the tension. But the room wasn't fooled. My father avoided looking at me completely, staring at his plate like the green beans had suddenly become the most fascinating thing in the world. That silence was more alarming than Daniel's words. Dad had always been blunt, never afraid to call Daniel out when he pushed too far. The fact that he said nothing now only confirmed what I feared. They knew. Daniel leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine like he owned the room. "It just makes sense," he continued, his voice dripping with confidence. "The house has more than enough space, and honestly, it's about time I settled somewhere permanent. Don't you agree?" He said it as if he were talking to the entire table, but his eyes were locked on me. He wanted to see me flinch, to see me break. I set down my fork carefully, refusing to give him what he wanted. "Interesting choice," I managed, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "And when exactly did you decide this?" I wasn't asking because I cared about his timeline. I wanted to hear the lie. He smiled wider, shrugging like it was nothing. "Oh, I've been thinking about it for a while now. The opportunity just lined up." His tone carried the kind of smugness that told me he knew something I didn't, and he was savoring every second of dangling it over my head. My mother's eyes flicked to mine just for a moment, and in that split second, I saw it, the truth she was trying so hard not to spill. She looked away quickly, pushing mashed potatoes around her plate. That was the moment the ground shifted beneath me. Something was already in motion, something they hadn't told me, and Daniel was enjoying being the one to reveal it in his own twisted way. I reached for my water, mostly to keep my hands busy, and tried to steady the panic rising in my chest. I thought about the countless nights I'd worked overtime, the weekends I'd sacrificed, the plans I'd canceled to save enough money for that house. It wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was proof that I could stand on my own, that I didn't need to be the family's afterthought anymore. And now, Daniel was treating it like a prize he could just claim. The conversation moved on awkwardly, Mom rambling about trivial things while Dad nodded silently, but I barely heard them. I watched Daniel, the way he smirked every time he caught me looking. He thought he had won, that he had blindsided me so completely, there was no way I could recover. But beneath the shock, beneath the sting of betrayal, something else began to stir inside me. A quiet resolve. I didn't know the details yet, but I could feel them circling me like shadows in the room. Whatever Daniel thought he had gained, whatever scheme he believed was airtight, he was forgetting one thing. I had built my life on surviving when no one believed I could. And now, with everyone silently taking his side, I realized this wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about power, about control, about finally deciding who got to win in this family. So, I kept my smile, let him gloat, and said nothing. Because the more he believed I was powerless, the easier it would be to take everything back, and more. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The rest of that dinner was a performance, each of us playing roles we didn't agree to but somehow knew by heart. My mother kept her voice light, telling pointless stories, laughing a little too loudly, pouring more wine into glasses that were barely touched. My father nodded at her anecdotes, never once lifting his eyes, never once acknowledging the bomb Daniel had dropped minutes earlier. It was like they were all in on a script I hadn't been given, one where my part was to stay silent and pretend nothing had happened. Daniel, of course, thrived in that silence. He sat taller in his chair, his grin stretching wider every time I didn't take his bait. He'd lean back, sip slowly, and occasionally glance at me with the look that said, "You know I've already won." I could almost hear the thoughts running through his head, the satisfaction of catching me off guard, of knowing he had delivered a blow I wasn't prepared for. I studied their faces, every twitch and glance, searching for answers. My mother's smile never quite reached her eyes, and though she tried to keep the conversation flowing, there was an uneasiness in the way she twisted her napkin under the table. Dad barely spoke a word, and when he did, it was about things so trivial they felt absurd. The weather, the new grocery store down the road, a TV show he didn't even like, anything but the topic hanging over all of us. The thing that unsettled me most was how ordinary it all looked on the surface. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a normal family dinner, food passed around, laughter forced but present, plates being filled and emptied. But I knew better. The smiles were masks, and the silence was loaded. Every second felt like they were hiding something from me, something I wasn't supposed to discover until it was too late. Daniel finally broke the charade with a casual remark. It'll be nice, to finally live somewhere stable, somewhere that feels like mine. He said it so smoothly, so deliberately, his eyes flicking toward me with a spark of triumph. My stomach tightened. He wasn't just making an announcement. He was staking a claim, right in front of everyone, daring them to contradict him. But no one did. I wanted to scream. I wanted to slam my hand on the table and demand answers, but instead I forced myself to laugh, a sound so foreign it startled even me. You've always had a way of surprising us, Daniel, I said, my voice calm, though I could feel the anger burning in my throat. He tilted his head, clearly enjoying the restraint I was forcing myself to keep. The meal dragged on, each bite harder to swallow than the last. When dessert was brought out, a pie that normally would have been comforting, I barely touched it. I kept watching them, waiting for someone to slip, for someone to let the truth spill out by accident. But they were careful, too careful. As I drove home later that night, the silence of my car pressed heavier than the dinner conversation had. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, my mind replaying every look, every word, every fake smile. They knew something. Daniel wasn't acting alone, and if I wanted to survive whatever game he was playing, I had to stop waiting for the truth to be handed to me. I had to dig for it myself. That night, lying awake in the house I still believed was mine, I couldn't shake the image of Daniel's smirk. He thought he'd set the stage, thought I was just a character in his story. But what he didn't know was that I had already decided to rewrite the ending. Sleep was impossible that night. I tossed from one side of the bed to the other, replaying Daniel's words and the empty smiles of my parents. Every creak in the house felt louder, every shadow stretched longer. It wasn't just paranoia, it was instinct. Something had shifted, something I hadn't been told, and Daniel's smugness confirmed it. His announcement wasn't just about moving in, it was a declaration that something had already been set in motion, something I hadn't agreed to. By morning, I was running on coffee and raw nerves. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, scrolling through emails, bank statements, anything that might hint at what he was talking about. Nothing looked unusual. The mortgage was current, the bills were paid, and my name was still listed where it had always been. But that only made me more uneasy. If Daniel was so confident, there had to be something else, something hidden from plain view. I thought back to the moment at dinner when my mother avoided my eyes. It was quick, almost invisible, but I knew my mother well enough to recognize guilt when I saw it. That wasn't just awkwardness, it was a secret she couldn't bear to say aloud. My father's silence, his refusal to look at me, had been another clue. They weren't caught off guard by Daniel's announcement. They had known. Which meant paperwork, something signed, something official was already in existence. I decided to stop speculating and start digging. The next weekend, I visited my parents under the guise of dropping off groceries. Mom greeted me with her usual smile, warm but strained, the kind of smile that said she was terrified of confrontation. I played my part, chatting casually, but my eyes were scanning the room, noting the clutter of unopened envelopes on the counter. While she fussed over where to put the milk, I slipped a few into my bag. I told myself I was only borrowing them, that I'd put them back once I knew what they contained. That night, at my own kitchen table, I tore them open one by one. Most were junk insurance reminders, community newsletters. But then I found it. A thick envelope addressed to my parents with my bank's logo stamped across the top. My hands shook as I unfolded the papers inside. The words blurred at first, but slowly they sharpened into the kind of nightmare you only read about. A transfer. My house, my home had been refinanced months ago. The deed moved quietly out of my sole name and into something shared, something I never signed. I sat frozen, the pages spread across the table like evidence in a crime scene. It wasn't just betrayal, it was legal. My own family had moved behind my back, Daniel circling like a vulture while my parents handed him the scraps of what I had built. My chest ached as I thought about all the sacrifices I had made. The years of saving and struggling, reduced to a set of signatures I never even saw. I wanted to call them immediately, to demand an explanation, but I stopped myself. Explosions wouldn't fix this. What I needed now wasn't rage, it was clarity. Daniel had been bold enough to announce it at dinner because he knew I was already trapped. But if there was one thing my brother had always underestimated, it was my ability to endure. As I gathered the papers into a neat pile, a strange calm washed over me. They had written me out of my own story, but they had done it thinking I would accept it, thinking I would bow out quietly. They had no idea that by keeping me in the dark, they had given me the one thing I needed most: time. Daniel thought he had cornered me with papers I never saw. What he didn't realize was that I had just uncovered my first weapon. I stared at the stack of papers on my kitchen table until the words blurred into nothing but black smudges. Every line, every signature I didn't make was proof that what I had worked for was no longer mine. But what stung even worse than the legal jargon was the realization that my parents, my own parents, had been complicit. Their silence at dinner, the way they let Daniel smirk and gloat, suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't some impulsive idea Daniel had cooked up. It had been planned, orchestrated, and carried out with their help. The more I sat there, the more memories started to unravel in my mind like an old film reel. Little moments I had brushed off at the time now came back with new meaning. I remembered the year Daniel dropped out of college and my father co-signed a loan to bail him out of debt, while I was told scholarships and part-time jobs were character building. I remembered my mother selling a necklace she swore she would never part with so Daniel could buy a used car, while I had to scrape together bus fare and beg rides from friends. Back then, I convinced myself it was just parents doing what they had to for their struggling son. But now, with these papers in front of me, I realized it wasn't just love, it was favoritism that had crossed into betrayal. One memory in particular burned in my chest. Years ago, when I first started saving for the house, I had brought my parents a folder filled with spreadsheets and plans. I was proud, showing them how determined I was to break free from debt and prove I could stand on my own. My mother had smiled politely, but my father had simply nodded, offering nothing more than a mumbled, "We'll see." A week later, Daniel had shown up at their door talking about a half-baked business idea, and suddenly there was excitement, encouragement, and even financial help. His failures were met with applause. My efforts were barely acknowledged. I thought buying the house had finally evened the scales, that maybe, just maybe, they would see I wasn't the lesser child after all. I can still remember the day I signed the mortgage papers, walking out of the bank with tears in my eyes, calling my mom to share the news. She congratulated me, but her tone lacked the warmth I had hoped for. At the time, I told myself she was distracted. Now I wondered if she already knew the house wouldn't truly be mine forever. The flashbacks kept coming, each one a reminder of how many times I had been the afterthought. School plays where my parents showed up late. Games where they forgot my name was even on the roster. Birthdays overshadowed by Daniel's crises. I had convinced myself those were just small wounds, the kind of scars every family left behind. But as I sat there in the dim light of my kitchen, the papers spread before me like evidence. I realized those scars had been the foundation for this betrayal. Anger surged, hot and sharp, but beneath it was something colder, steadier. I wasn't surprised that Daniel would manipulate his way into what I had built. That was who he had always been. What gutted me was my parents' choice to let him, to quietly sign away the proof of my independence without even giving me the dignity of a conversation. I gathered the papers and slid them back into their envelope, my hands steady despite the storm in my chest. If this was the path they had chosen, if they thought I would just roll over and let Daniel win yet again, they were sorely mistaken. I had spent a lifetime swallowing betrayals, convincing myself they weren't as bad as they felt. But this was different. This wasn't just a slight or a forgotten birthday. This was war, and for the first time, I was ready to fight back. Days passed after I found the papers, but the sting of betrayal only grew sharper. I carried myself through work, through errands, through conversations with friends, all the while feeling like I was living in a split reality. Outwardly, I was composed, answering emails and making small talk. Inside, I was consumed with the knowledge that my family had quietly stolen from me, handing over the very thing I had fought years to achieve. I told no one, not yet. I needed to gather more than rage. I needed information, leverage, a way to fight back that would actually matter. The answer came unexpectedly in the most ordinary of moments. I was at the grocery store staring blankly at a shelf of canned soup when I heard a voice behind me. "Claire?" It was Aunt Lydia, my mother's older sister, the one relative who had always seemed slightly removed from the family politics. She hugged me, her perfume strong, her eyes sharper than usual. After a bit of small talk, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. I heard about Daniel moving in. You must be surprised. The way she said it, almost testing me, made my pulse quicken. I forced a small laugh, nodding. Surprised is one word for it, I said, trying to sound casual. Her eyes flicked around the aisle, making sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in again. Listen, I shouldn't even be telling you this, but that house, sweetheart, it's not really yours anymore. You know that, right? The words landed like ice in my stomach, even though I already knew the truth from the papers. Hearing it confirmed by someone outside the immediate circle hit different. My throat tightened. What do you mean? I asked, though my voice came out flat. She sighed, adjusting her purse strap like she was carrying a burden too heavy. Your parents, they've been talking about this for months. Daniel came to them saying he needed stability, that he was finally ready to be responsible. They wanted to help him, Claire, they always do. Papers were signed, things shifted, and you… She hesitated, her eyes softening. You were left out of the conversation. I thought you should know. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I clutched the cart handle so hard my knuckles turned white. Why wouldn't they tell me? I whispered, though I already knew the answer, because they didn't think I mattered enough to include, because Daniel's needs would always outweigh mine. Aunt Lydia reached out, squeezing my arm gently. I don't agree with it. That house was your achievement, not theirs. But your parents? They see Daniel as fragile, as someone they have to protect at all costs. They assume you'll be fine. You always are. She looked at me with something like pity, and I hated it. Hated that even she saw me as the strong one who could survive anything. I forced a smile, thanking her, pretending her words hadn't ripped another layer off my already raw heart. We parted ways in the parking lot, her wave lingering as I loaded groceries into my trunk. Once I was alone, the mask slipped. I sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. My parents hadn't just betrayed me. They had written me out of the story entirely, placing Daniel at the center, like always. But Aunt Lydia's whispered warning did more than confirm what I already knew. It fueled me. If Daniel thought he had won, if my parents believed I would quietly accept being erased, they were wrong. Betrayal cut deep, but it also sharpened me. I wasn't going to beg for what was mine. I was going to take it back and make sure they never saw it coming. Aunt Lydia's warning echoed in my head for days, replaying every time I tried to sleep, every time I tried to focus on work. It's not really yours anymore. The words twisted like a knife, not because they were new, but because they came from someone outside the circle of silence. My parents hadn't just signed papers, they had agreed to erase me. And Daniel, with his smug announcement, was the face of it all. I couldn't let it go. I needed to know how far this betrayal went and what exactly he had planned once he moved in. I decided the only way forward was to confront him indirectly. Daniel thrived on confrontation. He wanted me to blow up, to scream, to accuse. That was his arena. But if I stayed calm, if I let him believe I was naive, maybe he would reveal what he was hiding. So I called him one evening, my voice carefully casual. Hey, I've been thinking about what you said at dinner. About moving in. Can we meet up? I just want to understand how this is supposed to work. He agreed too quickly, like he had been waiting for me to take the bait. We met at a coffee shop near downtown, the kind of place where Daniel liked to be seen. He walked in late, of course, sunglasses still on despite the dim light, greeting me with that same grin. Claire, glad you finally came around, he said as he slid into the booth. I forced a smile, sipping my coffee. I just want to be clear on the details. You said you were moving in, but how exactly did you plan that? The house isn't exactly open. His grin widened. Oh, come on. Don't play dumb. You think Mom and Dad wouldn't help me out? They've always wanted what's best for me. They knew I needed this, and they made it happen. Honestly, you should be grateful they're letting you stay too. It could have been worse. The arrogance in his tone made my stomach churn, but I kept my expression steady. So what? You're saying the place isn't even mine anymore? He leaned back, folding his arms like a king addressing a servant. Not exactly. Let's just say you're not the only one on the deed now. You've been carrying all the weight for years, but that's over. From now on, it's shared, more balanced. His words dripped with mock sympathy. That was the confirmation I needed. He wasn't just moving in, He believed he had legal authority, power over something I had built alone, and worse, he was relishing the thought of me being forced to watch him take it. I nodded slowly, feigning thoughtfulness. I see. Well, I guess that changes things. Thanks for being honest. My tone was even, almost polite, and I could see it irritated him that I didn't explode. He had expected a scene, maybe even hoped for one. Instead, I gave him nothing. But inside, my mind was racing. The trap had been laid, not just with the papers, but with their silence, their complicity. They had expected me to walk right into it blind, to accept the new reality without. Protest Daniel had unveiled his hand, and in doing so, he revealed his weakness, his arrogance. He thought the victory was already his, that I was too beaten down to fight back. As I left the coffee shop, the evening air felt colder than it should have. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, replaying his words, his smirk, his confidence. They had built a trap and waited for me to stumble in, but what they didn't realize was that I had no intention of staying caught. If they wanted a game, then fine, I would play. Only this time, I would be the one writing the rules. I left that coffee shop with my heart pounding, the bitter taste of Daniel's smug words clinging to me like smoke, not exactly yours anymore. The way he had said it, so casually, so confidently, confirmed everything I had feared since the family dinner. My parents hadn't just betrayed me, they had legally tied me to him, binding my hard work to his recklessness. The house, my house, was no longer mine alone, it was ours, and in Daniel's mind, that meant his. The first thing I did when I got home was dig through the envelope of documents again, this time reading every line with the sharp focus of someone looking for a crack in the walls of a prison. The refinancing papers were all there, and tucked in the back was a copy of the updated deed. My name was still on it, but right beside it, in bold black ink, was his. Daniel Thomas Whitman, equal owner. I stared at those words until my eyes blurred. Memories flooded back, images of long nights working overtime, weekends spent skipping dinners with friends just to save money, moments when I felt proud of my independence. All of it had led me to this house, this symbol of survival. And now, with the stroke of a pen I never held, my family had cut that independence in half. The betrayal stung deeper because of how clean it all looked. To anyone else, it was just paperwork, signatures neatly in place, stamped and sealed. But to me, it was a theft dressed up as legality. Daniel hadn't earned this house. He hadn't worked for it. He had simply convinced our parents to gift him half of mine, cloaking it as balance or stability. He would never admit it, but I could see the truth written across every line. This was less about needing a home and more about taking something from me. I remembered the way he leaned back at the coffee shop, his grin widening every time I didn't react. He had expected me to fight, to scream, maybe even to cause a scene that would justify the narrative he had probably already spun for our parents, that I was unstable, that I couldn't handle the responsibility. Instead, I gave him nothing, and that, I realized, was my first victory. Still, the reality weighed on me. Legally, he was tied to me now. That meant every decision, every repair, every bill would be something he had a claim to. He could walk in at any moment, throw his clothes into the closet, and call it home. The thought of him strolling through my living room, feet on the coffee table, beer cans scattered on the counter, made my skin crawl. This wasn't just about space, it was about control, about erasing the one thing that made me proud. For a while, I just sat there, the deed spread out in front of me, feeling the weight of it all. I wanted to cry, but the tears never came. Instead, what rose inside me was sharper, colder. If Daniel thought sharing, ownership meant he had won, then he didn't understand me at all. Sharing meant I still had a place at the table, and that meant I still had a say. I folded the papers carefully, sliding them back into the envelope. My hands no longer trembled. The truth was clear now, the twist unveiled. The house wasn't mine anymore, not completely. But it wasn't his either. And if he thought I would just step aside while he claimed it as his prize, he was in for a surprise. This was no longer about ownership, it was about survival, and I had no intention of losing. After I slid the deed back into its envelope, I sat in the quiet of my living room, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, the only sound breaking the silence. My first instinct had been to storm back to my parents' house, to shove the papers in their faces and demand answers, to scream at Daniel until my throat was raw. But rage was exactly what he wanted. He thrived on chaos, and if I gave it to him, he would twist it into proof that I couldn't handle responsibility. No, if I was going to fight this battle, it couldn't be loud. It had to be silent, calculated, something he wouldn't see coming until it was too late. So I made a choice that night. I would play along. I would smile when he gloated, nod when my parents looked at me with pity, and pretend I had accepted the new arrangement. And while they relaxed, believing I had surrendered, I would quietly build my plan. Revenge wouldn't come through shouting or fighting, it would come through patience and precision. The first step was research. I spent nights reading everything I could about property law, shared ownership, and legal loopholes. I combed through forums and blogs, scrolling through stories of siblings and families torn apart by houses and inheritances. At first it felt overwhelming, but slowly, patterns started to emerge. Ownership on paper didn't guarantee control. There were ways to protect myself, ways to box Daniel in so tightly that his so-called victory would feel more like a prison. During the day, I played my part. When Daniel called to check in, I kept my voice even, feigning indifference. "Sure, we'll figure it out when you move in," I told him once, and I could practically hear the satisfaction in his laugh. At family dinners, I smiled and kept conversation light, even when I wanted to choke on every word. It wasn't easy. Every glance from my father, every nervous smile from my mother reminded me of their betrayal. But showing my anger now would only fuel Daniel's story, so I bit my tongue and let them believe they had won. What they didn't know was that behind that calm exterior, I was already moving pieces. I contacted a lawyer, not one my family knew, but someone recommended through a colleague at work. I didn't explain everything at first. I just asked questions. Hypothetical scenarios. What happens when two names are on a deed, but one person has put in all the money? What happens if one tries to move in without consent? The answers gave me fuel. Ownership might have been shared, but authority could still be challenged, especially when financial contributions were lopsided. At night, I started documenting everything. Receipts, bank statements, home repairs, I had paid for all of it, went into a folder. Every nail, every coat of paint, every cent that had gone into this house was proof that Daniel's claim was paper thin compared to mine. If it came to a fight, I wanted evidence stacked so high he wouldn't be able to climb over it. The hardest part was staying quiet. Every time I saw his smug face, every time I caught my mother avoiding my eyes, I had to swallow my fury and remind myself of the bigger picture. Daniel thought he had trapped me. He thought I was powerless, but what he didn't realize was that silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Sitting in that quiet house, the same house I had fought so hard for, I made myself a promise. If Daniel wanted a war, he would get one. But it wouldn't be loud or reckless. It would be slow, deliberate, and devastating. By the time he realized what I was doing, it would already be too late. The more I thought about Daniel's smug confidence, the more I realized he couldn't have pulled this off alone. He was many things: lazy, entitled, manipulative, but he wasn't clever, not really. He thrived when others paved the way for him, when doors were opened that he could simply stroll through. The refinancing, the paperwork, the signatures, I never saw. Those weren't his doing. Someone else had orchestrated it. Someone pulling strings behind the curtain, smoothing the path so he could waltz in and take half of what was mine. At first, I thought it had to be my parents. After all, the guilt on my mother's face and my father's silence were damning enough. But the deeper I thought, the more I realized they didn't have the resources or the boldness to make this happen on their own. They were pawns, complicit but not in control. Daniel had someone else in his corner, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the system. I found my first clue one afternoon when I overheard a phone call. I had stopped by my parents' house under the pretense of dropping off some groceries again. Daniel was already there, his voice carrying through the hallway as he spoke in the study. "Yeah, it's all set," he said, his tone relaxed. "She has no idea. The lawyer handled everything. No, she won't fight it, trust me, she's predictable." I froze in place, my pulse racing. A lawyer. That was the missing piece. Of course, Daniel wouldn't have figured out the logistics alone. He had help, someone guiding him through the legalities, making sure every box was checked, every paper signed. The question was, who? I stepped quietly into the kitchen before he could catch me listening, my hands shaking as I placed the groceries on the counter. My mother fussed over the bags, her eyes flicking toward the study with the same nervousness I had seen at dinner. She knew. She knew Daniel wasn't working alone, and she was terrified I'd find out. That fear only confirmed what I already suspected. This was bigger than just favoritism. This was a scheme. Over the next week, I began watching more carefully. Daniel slipped up more than once, dropping little hints in his arrogance. He mentioned meetings, signing schedules, and once even let slip a name I didn't recognize, someone he called Reynolds. My stomach sank when I looked it up later and discovered Reynolds was a local attorney, the kind who specialized in property disputes and asset transfers. Daniel hadn't just lucked into this. He had someone professional working with him, guiding every move. That knowledge burned, but it also clarified things. If Reynolds had been involved, it meant Daniel was playing this like a business deal, not a family arrangement. He wasn't moving in because he needed stability. He was moving in because he wanted leverage, control, and maybe even profit. My house wasn't his sanctuary, it was his investment. One night, sitting at my desk with the folder of receipts and records I had been compiling, I let the anger wash over me, then forced myself into focus. If Daniel had strings behind the curtain, then so would I. He wasn't the only one who could use silence and planning as weapons. I had already begun my own documentation, my own research. Now I needed to expand. If he thought a lawyer could protect him, I would find someone sharper. As I closed the folder and set it aside, a strange calm settled over me again. Daniel believed he had turned the game in his favor by pulling others into his corner. But what he didn't know was that the moment he involved outsiders, he made mistakes. Mistakes leave trails, and trails can be followed. The strings he thought were protecting him would eventually be the very ones I used to drag him down. By the time the next family dinner rolled around, I had already gathered enough evidence to know exactly what Daniel had been up to. The name Reynolds kept popping up, not just in his carelessly dropped hints, but also in the paperwork trail I had quietly uncovered. Every signature, every legal step had his fingerprints on it. Daniel might have been the face of the betrayal, but Reynolds was the architect. Still, I wasn't ready to confront either of them outright. Not yet. I wanted to watch them squirm under the weight of their own assumptions, to let them believe I was still in the dark. When I walked into my parents' house that Sunday, I could feel the tension before I even crossed the threshold. My mother greeted me with her usual smile, but her eyes betrayed the same nervous flicker I had seen before. My father gave me a stiff nod, his posture rigid as he settled back into his chair at the head of the table. And there was Daniel, already seated, wine glass in hand, smirk plastered across his face like a badge of honor. Dinner began with the usual forced small talk. My mother asked about work, my father muttered about the news, and Daniel interjected with thinly veiled comments about big changes coming soon. I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to take the bait, to ask, to act like the little sister begging for scraps of information. But I refused. Instead, I smiled, cutting my chicken with deliberate calm, offering polite answers as though nothing at all was out of place. It was Daniel who cracked first. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork, leaned back, and said loudly, "So Claire, I guess we should talk about the move. I've been making plans." He waited, eyes gleaming, expecting me to falter. I didn't. I took a slow sip of water, placed the glass down, and smiled. "That's wonderful, Daniel. I hope you've thought through all the responsibilities that come with it." The table went silent. My mother's eyes darted between us. My father stared harder at his plate, and Daniel's smirk faltered just enough for me to notice. He wasn't expecting composure, he was expecting outrage. And when I didn't give it to him, his confidence wavered. "Of course I have," he said quickly, trying to recover. "It's not like I'm new to responsibility." The irony of that statement almost made me laugh, but I kept my expression neutral. "Good," I replied evenly, "because this isn't just about moving in. There are bills, maintenance, legalities. It's not as simple as claiming space, but I'm sure you already know that." For the first time, Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My mother tried to jump in, babbling about dessert, but the damage was already done. He knew I knew, and though he couldn't quite figure out how much I had uncovered, the seed of doubt was planted. As the dinner dragged on, I let him stew. Every polite smile I gave, every calm response was a reminder that his victory lap wasn't going the way he planned. By the time dessert was served, his smirk had faded into a tight line, his laughter forced, his wine glass emptied too quickly. Driving home that night, I felt the shift. The trap he thought he had set was beginning to close in on him instead. My silence wasn't weakness, it was power. And now, with the aftermath of that dinner still hanging in the air, I knew it was only a matter of time before Daniel realized the game had changed. The next move wouldn't be his, it would be mine. The car ride home from that dinner felt different from the others. My grip on the steering wheel was looser, my shoulders lighter. For the first time since Daniel had made his announcement, I felt like the ground wasn't tilting beneath me. He had expected me to crumble in front of our parents, to react the way I always did as the one left out, the one scrambling to keep up. But that night, I had turned the script. I had given him composure instead of chaos, calm instead of collapse, and I saw the flicker of doubt cross his face. It was small, but it was enough to remind me that Daniel thrived on power he didn't actually possess. And once that power was questioned, the cracks began to show. In the days that followed, I kept my silence, but I didn't stop moving. I met again with the lawyer I had quietly consulted, this time laying out every detail. The refinancing, the signatures, the shared ownership, everything I had discovered went on the table. My lawyer studied the documents, flipping through them carefully, his brow furrowed. "It's messy," he admitted, "but not airtight. Especially if you can prove financial imbalance." That was the opening I needed. Every receipt, every bank statement, every hour of overtime I had poured into that house became ammunition. The trap Daniel thought he had built for me was riddled with holes, and I was already preparing to pull it apart. Meanwhile, Daniel grew bolder. He started showing up at the house unannounced, walking through the living room with the arrogance of a man who thought he owned the place. He'd open the fridge, grab a drink, and drop hints about his room and his furniture delivery. I let him. I smiled politely, asked if he needed anything, and never raised my voice. But the entire time, I kept track dates, times, everything he did that blurred the line between ownership and intrusion. The twist came one rainy Thursday evening. Daniel had dropped by again, tossing his jacket onto the couch, his phone buzzing with messages he didn't bother to hide. He was laughing, smug as always, until he received one call that changed his entire demeanor. His voice dropped, his tone serious, and for once I could hear strain in his words. "What do you mean it didn't go through?" He snapped into the phone, pacing the length of the living room. "No, I was promised this was solid. Reynolds guaranteed." He stopped mid-sentence, realizing too late that I was standing in the doorway, listening. His face tightened, his bravado cracking for just a second before he hung up. That was when I realized the twist. Daniel hadn't just been maneuvering to move into my house. He had been planning to leverage it. The refinancing, the shared deed, the lawyer, all of it was part of a bigger scheme. He wanted to use the house as collateral, a bargaining chip for whatever reckless plan he had cooked up. And now, something had gone wrong. I didn't call him out. Not then. Instead, I smiled faintly, walked past him, and said, "Dinner's on the stove if you're hungry." He stared at me, suspicious, waiting for a confrontation. But when none came, he grabbed his jacket and left, muttering into his phone as the rain swallowed him outside. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet, I pieced everything together. Daniel hadn't wanted stability. He had wanted opportunity. He wasn't looking to move in for comfort. He was looking to move in for control. But his arrogance had blinded him, and now his plan was crumbling. He didn't know that I had already armed myself with evidence, that I had already secured legal counsel. He didn't know that the house he thought was his golden ticket was about to become his downfall. The real plot twist wasn't that my house had been taken from me. It was that in trying to take it, Daniel had set himself up to lose everything. He thought he had played me, but all he had really done was expose his weakness. And as I looked at the folder of documents on my desk, neatly organized and ready, I realized I was no longer on defense. The next move was mine, and when I made it, Daniel wouldn't just lose the house. He'd lose the illusion of power he had built his whole life on. For once, I wasn't the one standing in the shadows of my family. For once, I was the one pulling the strings. The morning after Daniel's phone call, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The rain from the night before still clung to the windows, streaking the glass like the remnants of a storm that had already passed. But inside me, the storm had quieted. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't scrambling to protect what was mine or trying to prove my worth to a family that had never seen it. For the first time, I felt in control. The documents, the lawyer, the evidence, it was all ready. Daniel had no idea that while he thought he was closing me out, I was already setting the stage for his undoing. I decided to confront my parents first, not with yelling, not with accusations, but with the same composure that had unsettled Daniel at dinner. I invited them over to the house one evening, sitting them down at the kitchen table where I had once celebrated signing the mortgage papers, the same table where I had dreamed of freedom. I slid the folder of documents across to them, watching as their faces shifted from confusion to dread. "I know everything," I said quietly. "The refinancing, the deed, Reynolds Daniel's plans to use this house for more than just living." My mother's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she touched the folder. My father leaned back, silent as always, but his jaw tightened. They didn't try to deny it. They didn't try to explain. The silence itself was admission. For a moment, I let it hang there, heavy and suffocating, before I continued. "You thought I wouldn't find out. You thought I'd accept being erased. But here's the truth: you gave Daniel half a house he didn't earn, and he's already destroying it. And now I'm the one who has the power to stop him." My father finally spoke, his voice low. "He's your brother." He needed help. I met his eyes steadily. And I didn't? All those years, I fought for this house, worked until I could barely stand, and you watched me do it alone. You didn't see me needing help because you never expected me to succeed in the first place. You only saw Daniel. You always have. The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. When they left that night, I knew something in our relationship had cracked beyond repair. But strangely, I didn't feel broken. I felt free. For once, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I wasn't chasing their acknowledgement. I was standing on my own, exactly where I had always belonged. Daniel, though, was another matter. He showed up 2 days later, swaggering into the house like he owned it, but the cracks in his confidence were visible now. His phone buzzed nonstop, and I could see the strain etched into his face. I waited until he dropped his bag on the couch before I spoke. "You should be more careful with your deals, Daniel. Word gets around when loans fall through. When collateral doesn't hold," his head snapped up, his smirk faltering. "What are you talking about?" I walked past him calmly, picking up his jacket and tossing it toward him. "You thought I didn't know. But I know everything. The refinancing, Reynolds, the calls you've been making. You tried to use this house as your safety net, but you forgot one thing: it was never yours to gamble with." His face went pale, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a defense. But I didn't give him the chance. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. I have every receipt, every record, every piece of evidence showing this house was built on my back, not yours. If you try to push this, if you try to claim more than your half on paper, you'll lose everything. And trust me, Daniel, I won't hesitate to make sure you do." For once, he didn't have a comeback. The silence that followed was more satisfying than any argument we had ever had. He grabbed his jacket, muttering something under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I stood there in the quiet, looking around at the house that had been the center of so much pain and betrayal. It didn't feel the same as it once had, but it was still mine. Not in the way it had been before, but in the way that truly mattered, because the final word wasn't written in a deed or decided by signatures. It was in the resolve to stand tall when others tried to cut me down, in the strength to fight back without losing myself. Daniel would always be my brother. My parents would always be my parents, but their choices no longer defined me. I had found my voice in silence, my strength in betrayal, and my victory in patience. And as I closed the folder of documents and tucked it safely away, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The house may have been shared on paper, but in every way that mattered, it would always belong to me. In the end, Daniel's smirk was gone, my parents' silence exposed for what it truly was, and the house stood not as a symbol of defeat, but of resilience. The power he thought he had over me crumbled the moment I refused to react on his terms. That was the reversal he never saw coming. Real power wasn't in papers or signatures. It was in patience, in strategy, in refusing to be broken. I didn't need to scream or slam doors to reclaim what was mine. I simply stood taller, armed with truth and watched as his confidence collapsed under the weight of his own arrogance. For the first time, the balance shifted. He wasn't the center of the story anymore, I was. So when I tell you this, understand it's not just about a house. It's about every moment you've been underestimated, every time someone has tried to erase you. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud. It's the quiet strength to outlast, outthink, and outshine. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the sweetest victory is simply refusing to lose.